All right, everyone, welcome, and welcome back from the break. We're going to transition in the course from our focus on biblical narrative to biblical poetry. Normally on a literature course, I would spend the majority of the time on the poetry as opposed to the narrative, but as I said, the majority of the Bible is written in narrative rather than poetry, so it is appropriate that we spent that basically first half of the course looking at narrative, but now we're going to get to the poetry and look at the particular features of biblical poetry, which are not the same, at least not exactly the same as classical poetry, or at least the features of it. So much so, and let me just make a brief comment on this, in the 18th century, a bishop by the name of Robert Louth, who is also the Oxford professor of poetry, translated the Hebrew, at least the book of, I'm trying to think now whether it was the book of Job or what it was. I've forgotten exactly. But he used a lecture on the sacred poetry of the Hebrews is what it was called. And Louth commented that about the fact that biblical poetry translated extremely well into vernacular, extremely well, such that there's a power and a potency in the English rendition of the Psalms, for instance, that was unparalleled in other languages. So, for instance, Homer's Odyssey or any of the great Greek literary works, when they're translated, they just simply you can't replicate the original's power and its evocative nature and so forth, whereas Hebrew poetry, it seems translated rather well. And so this brought him to speculate on why that was, and he said that it was because Hebrew diction was natural as opposed to artificial, which is really an interesting comment for those who are interested in literary matters. But he directly connected it with that, and I, in my own work on the subject, noted the influence of Louth's connection of biblical poetry with nature to the development of the Romantic movement in England, and the idea of getting back to nature. And I think that trope of getting back to nature and seeing nature in its origins and speech in its origins, what is natural and least artificial is best, is seriously problematic, but it was very influential at the time. And Louth, among other things, said that the Hebrew authors did not use schemes and tropes and the means of classical adornment of literature at all. It was just expressive, spontaneous overflows of, and so therefore it was sublime. And sublimity was the category of literary excellence in the 18th century. So Louth, as a literary critic, was observing something about the Bible that really he's talking about its power, but he's connecting it with nature. And I think this idea of the natural being closer to God is still with evangelicals to some degree. When they get into the presence of nature, they feel like they're getting closer to the presence of God. And when I say evangelicals, I'm talking about evangelicals since that time. Historic evangelicalism, Calvin, Luther, the magisterial reformers would have never made this connection. But from the Enlightenment onwards, there is this strong emphasis on self-expression and on natural expression and a move against artifice because of this idea that poetry at its best is natural and not artificial, not poetic in terms of the devices used and so forth. Louth's hypothesis, by the way, has now been firmly rebuked. And it has been observed that Hebrew poetry does, in fact, have clear and distinct poetic marks. It's just they differ from the Greek and Latin ones, which Louth assumed were normative. And so I'm going to talk a bit about those features. In fact, I'll talk about those features over the next several weeks, but just I wanted to open with that comment because there's no doubt for anybody who picks up the Psalms that they retain their poetic power. Even somebody who's not a believer will acknowledge this. And I said to you in the UK when I listened to this program, Desert Island Discs, they gave everyone the works of Shakespeare and the Bible as their core text because they assumed that they would regard these as indispensable literary works, if not religious works. There's something in being an Englishman or English person that is captured in that language. And as I say, I have my own issues with that take, but it's just interesting. Nowadays, the Bible is not much read as a text. Christians hopefully read the Bible and honor it in public worship services. Evangelicals historically identified themselves as being under the authority of the Word of God. In fact, being marked by adherence to the Word of God. But the public universities once also regarded the Bible as the necessary text for understanding Western culture. Back to the time when I was an undergraduate in the 1980s. As I told you, my professor said to us, if you want to read English literature and study it seriously, you have to read the Bible. And she's not talking about, in order to understand her, she's saying literature. And all authors up until the 1960s will have had some acquaintance, if not adhere to the Christian faith. They are certainly reacting to it or against it, and it's in the backdrop, in their allusions, in their themes, in their motifs. It's all there. So you can't ignore it. Now, I say that because nowadays it is being ignored. And I think the consequence of it is terrible for the impoverishment of the university. So I started the course by talking about Northrop Frye, who was the principal at Victoria College for many years and Canada's foremost literary critic, and he wrote several works on the Bible as literature, including one called The Great Code, in which he uses a phrase from William Blake, who he wrote his doctoral thesis on. The Great Code being the Bible. The Bible is the great code of Western art. And then he wrote a later one called Words of Power, analyzing it not really as a Christian, more as a literary critic. And as I say, that's become somewhat unfashionable, but in his day, people would flock to hear his courses, whether they were Christians or not Christians, because of the power and the potency of not just the lectures, but the material. So let's look at the biblical poetry, though, with that in mind. And I don't want to agree with Louth on this, that biblical poetry is basically natural, unadorned speech. Rather, I will agree with Ryken and agree with this definition. Poetry is heightened speech, far more compressed than prose. If you're in my practical criticism course, we talked about Coleridge's definition of poetry and said that poetry is metrical language. Biblical poetry doesn't seem to follow that same standard. It's not iambic pentameter, it's not a tetrameter, it's not that. So it doesn't have that feature, and so Louth says it's not poetry, it's not adorned artificial language. But it does have some of the same features that metrical language does, namely it has a pattern of repetition, which is what metrical language is. It has a beat. It's just not a beat every second syllable, like in an iamb. There's an unstressed syllable and then a stressed one. Rather, the parallelism takes place in various other forms, and chiefly in the forms of schemes and tropes. And I'm going to talk about schemes and tropes in this class and probably the next one as well, and at least give the overview of that, and then I'll speak further about particular types of schemes and tropes. But so poetry is heightened speech. It's far more compressed than prose. We find it is used in very important circumstances in the Bible. For instance, in the creation of Adam and Eve, the author-translator has put aside the recounting of the creation of Adam and Eve. That's put in poetic language. There's also a parallelism in it. Let me just go put this up on the screen so that you have in your mind's eye what I'm, oh, why did I do that? I'll do it here. You can see how it's set out from the text. So, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So threefold parallelism there. You can also see God over here and God over here, his own image, and then his own image is the chiasmus. Characteristic type of biblical poetry as well. There's a parallelism, there's a contrast. So there's an analogy being made, and yet there's something different about the two as well. I'm not going to talk about this particularly, but I'm just saying right at the very outset we note that there are lines that are seemingly so different that every translator sets them apart in the text as unique. And so these are poetic words and written in parallelism. Parallelism is a specific and very common feature of biblical poetry. And it is a pattern of repetition, just like meter. There's a regularity to it. And the regularity of the meter, or the regularity of the repetition, marks the regularity, as we saw when we looked at Genesis 1, of God's creation. On the first day, he created, on the second day, on the third day, on the fourth day, and at the end of several of them, and it was good, and it was good. There's a refrain. That's a parallelism. The parallelism suggests an order. The order suggests a goodness. So it's not just artificial, it's not just there for the purposes of beauty, to beautify the text. It's to say that there's something important being translated there. And furthermore, that you can't dispense with it. So for instance, when it comes to the creation of mankind, both man as one is being identified. When it says him, it's referring to the two together. But it's also talking about them distinctly, male and female. The two together are man, and yet each uniquely is also man. So that there's the unity in diversity. And something's being said about human nature there. And something's being said also about God's nature, by the way, because he also says, let us make man in our image, plural. Theologians will talk about the implicit reference to the Trinity here. It's clear, however, that male and female here there's diversity. There's not just one, there are two. And yet the two together are seen as so importantly connected that they are seen as a unity. And of course the two will become flesh, will become one flesh and be fruitful and multiply and so forth. So there's a lot of theological weight behind these poetic texts, and you could spend a series of sermons unpacking that theological significance. In fact, on this particular matter, you could spend a lifetime on the significance of it. But here it's just compressed language, and it's not, as theologians say, unpacked. I find it a frustrating term, but it's not very poetic. Unpacked, so let's unpack it. Okay, we'll take things out of the suitcase. But, so it's heightened speech. It's far more compressed than prose. You can see that the way it's put on the page. And let's make a distinction. Whereas expository prose uses the sentence or a paragraph as the basic unit. And narrative, the episode or scene, the basic unit of poetry is the individual image or figure of speech. So I'll repeat that for you. Although I took it from Riken, page 159. But I'll repeat it for you. Whereas expository prose uses the sentence or paragraph as its basic unit, and narrative, the episode or scene, the basic unit of poetry is the individual image or figure of speech. So it's a smaller portion of it. So expository, you've got a long sentence or a whole paragraph, and in narrative, an entire episode. We've seen that by looking at the life of Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, and these were a series of episodes or scenes connected sequentially. We saw that. Whereas here in basic poetry, we'll just get individual images or figures of speech that will be used. So and I will suggest it's just simply a condensed or compressed version of the larger. So it's not that prose and poetry are categorically, they are distinct, but they're not totally different entities. And the reason that poetry is used is to make it memorable. That goes in the New Testament as well. When something's put in the form of a hymn, we'll come to the hymn as a literary form later on in the semester. It is meant to be remembered and used in song and so forth. So to this day, many Christian worship lyrics, to this day in some congregations, they only sing psalms. But even if they don't, many of the images that they use for their lyrics derive from the psalms, because the images are so potent and beautiful and evocative, and not just beautiful, but they seem to express something profound and true, which you can't just replace. Like, you can talk about, shepherds and sheep. Well, how do you translate that into a society where we don't have shepherds and sheep? Well, try and do that. I don't know what the shepherd and the sheep replacement would be in our culture even. Any ideas? As soon as you translate it, you lose something of the original context. So a shepherd looks after sheep. Okay, fair enough. Well, a pastor is a shepherd, by the way. So there's one analogy. As soon as the leader of the congregation looks after the people, okay, but then what is important and about the life of a shepherd? Well, the shepherd feeds the sheep. The shepherd also fights the wolf, whereas a person in a church looking after a congregation, does that person fight the wolf? Well, who's the wolf? I mean, maybe he does, and he probably ought to. But as soon as you drop the idea of a pastor or a shepherd out of the mix and just talk of him as a teacher, teachers don't fight wolves in general. Present company accepted, of course. But you don't think of teacher, like if you want to speak of your pastor as a teacher, that is one of his functions, but that's not the same as a pastor as in a shepherd. A shepherd does more than teach. He feeds, and he takes care of, he looks after, he fights off the enemy, he goes out and makes sure that no harm comes to them, he applies salve to their wounds, etc. So that's more than just the teaching function. So these images are there, and I don't think they can be translated, really. The same with bread and wine. Bread and wine are basic food units in the ancient world. But note that they're not natural ones, by the way, as well. Bread, it takes a great deal of cultivation to get. First of all, you've got to grow the grain so that it becomes wheat, and then you got to pulverize the grain. And then you got to mix it with water and knead it up and add some yeast, and then you got to bake it, and all that, at the end of that, you get bread. So it's a highly cultivated food unit. You can't replace it with a grain of wheat on your communion tray. It's a Same with wine, actually. Wine is the product of the most difficult agricultural product to cultivate, the grape, most susceptible to disease and temperature fluctuations and so forth. It takes a high degree of care and concern and cultivation to create. So we don't just eat a piece of wheat and a grape when we have communion. We're eating something that's been cultivated. It's a product of human culture, and yet it's a product of human culture that's there for our nutrition. So we can't go back to nature and just replace it with, I don't know what, beer and a hot dog. I have no idea. I mean, those are cultural products as well, by the way, both of them. Hot dogs are just particularly disgusting. Like the worst aspects of meat thrown into a sausage container. But it's a cultural product. So when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," note that he's not blessing a natural thing. He's blessing something that is a cultivated product, and he's saying that it represents his body. So to get closer to Jesus and to experience his body and blood isn't to get back to nature. It's to get to the right form of cultivated human capacity and to experience that for our good. It's saying something about Christ and culture, in other words. and the relation, the right relation to nature. So all of that was just off the top of my head, but I think it's interesting, right? And of course, they're heavily symbolic, both of them, right? The bread and the wine, which is obvious when you use the metaphor, or the simile rather. This is my, or actually it's a metaphor, this is my body. He doesn't say it's like my body, he says it is my body. So there's an identification. Is this a figure of speech, or is he saying literally this is my body? Well, nobody thinks that's the case. Otherwise it would be cannibalism. Right? He's not calling upon his disciples to be cannibals, but he is not. He's also not using a simile. He's using a metaphor. He's saying this thing is that thing. Well, in what way is this that? That's where the theology really kicks in then. In what way, when we use a language and say this is that, and yet we think of body, okay, and then bread, in what sense are those two identical? Because he's making an identification. It's clearly a metaphor, but it's one that isn't simply, it's a little bit like it. He's saying it is that. There's a lot to unpack there, to use the word again. So, again, the basic unit of poetry are these individual images or figures of speech. And so poems think in terms of images. Let me give the illustration of Psalm 91, this wonderful psalm. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked, because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge. No evil shall be allowed to befall you. No plague shall come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him, because he knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. So this wonderful psalm, which is oft recited and read in worship services, at least in my experience, provides with a whole series of images here. And I find it just full of pictures. There's a shelter, or a shadow, or a refuge, or a fortress. All of these have similar meanings, but they're also not the same. He's calling upon all of them, identifying them, and yet there's a uniqueness to each of the images. They all add a little bit of color to the picture. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to repeat them with different words. And these are not just, he's not going through his thesaurus and picking out synonyms. There's an aspect to these which reflects something about the nature of God in relation to the person who trusts in him, he who dwells in the shelter. And furthermore, he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler. Now, fowler is a bird catcher, and they work by means of glue and traps. You lay down strings, and they get their foot in them, and they get caught up. If you know, have anyone caught birds before? I haven't, but I know how it works, more or less. So you can either do it through glue, in which they get stuck on it and they can't fly away, or it's some means like they call them springs, a trap. It's like a string of some sort. and it's the branch is bent down so that when something steps in it, it springs up and they're caught. You can do it with small animals as well, but fowlers will catch birds by that means. You can't shoot a bird with an arrow very easily, or there's not much left of the bird. And similarly with a gun, you would have to be rather careful about it, but they don't have guns there, needless to say. And if you used a sling like David used on Goliath, I don't think there'd be much left of the bird either, like whack, explode the bird. So you catch them with a string. Sorry for the indulgence in my bloody mindedness here. You will deliver you from the snare of the fowl and from the deadly pestilence. Now these things don't really mix. One is a physical threat, one that you can see. The pestilence is like a disease that you can't see. So things seen and unseen, physical threats that are seen and physical threats that are unseen, both of them reflecting. So, and again, this is typical Hebrew poetry. In its opposition, it's covering everything in between. So as far as the alpha is from the omega, for the east from the west, these are terms of opposition that include everything. So it's not just these two particular things, or it's visible and invisible, it's everything. And it's a way of expressing that. And he will cover you with his pinions. Now, God being presented as a big bird himself, which is a little odd. Not, I'm thinking Big Bird from Sesame Street now, and I want to get that thought out of my head. But, and you'll find refuge under his wings. Well, it's again evocative to people who've observed birds and how their young ones are protected by the mother from the rain or from the sun, because it's both. The sun is a greater threat than the rain. The sun is so hot that you will literally perish in the sun if you're not protected. And the mother bird will do that. And his faithfulness is a shield and a buckler. So a whole series of images here, one being presented after the next. And all of them present a composite portrait of complete protection from everything, seen and unseen. Every threat conceivable really is being presented here. So the images are experiential. And in that sense, this is precisely why they work so well. There are things that we can identify with, images that we can identify with, particularly if we've been involved in the sorts of situations that are being presented here. But even if we haven't, as soon as it's been explained to us, then we get it. You won't fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day. So day and night. Again, note the terms of opposition that include everything in between them. This is, again, typical biblical poetry. So these are images, and they're images that need to be experienced, and experience is essential to poetry. It's a very experiential medium. I mean, all language is, but this even more so because, again, it's intense and compressed. But it also, because of its compression and its intensity, it needs to be interpreted, to be understood. Words always need exposition. Images in particular need exposition. So you enjoy them simply by reading them. And if you stop and pause to comment at every point where you meet something that is obscure, then you ruin the whole poem, of course, or the psalm. You have to let it sort of wash over you like a wave. But on the other hand, you don't really grasp it until you start to exposit it and interpret it. But when you come to interpret it, how do you do that? That becomes the question. How do we interpret poetry? And that is one of the things we're going to grapple with on this course. Because my conviction, which I've stated from the outset, is that the poetry, just like the narrative, can be seen unto itself, and it needs to be seen unto itself in the individual passages, but it also needs to be seen in the light of the whole passage. So an episode from the life of Abraham needs to be seen in the context of the whole life of Abraham, from the beginning to the end, but also in the context of the whole Bible, which is also, as I've said, I think I've said at any rate, is a work of fabulous technology, which reflects a theological conviction, which is that there's a unity between these different books written by different authors in different ages and different genres, and yet there's a narrative thread that unites them all, and there's one God that inspired them all and speaks through them all. That conviction is expressed in the thing that we call the Bible. It's a technological work. They decided, rather than using a papyrus, which was the original form of writing, you'd write on a papyrus and you have to come in with the scrolls, several scrolls just to read one book. Well, now they've been stuck back to back, so you can flip back and forth between pages and between passages, and that's the point, that's the intention. It is to be read that way. That's why it was put together that way. Isn't that interesting? Right? It expresses a theological position. That it's not just simply for expedience sake. Like you can have your Bible on your phone. That's expedient. But what you can't get with the Bible on your phone is you can't flip back between the passages. It doesn't have that sense of, you can in the sense you can look it up and so forth, but you can't go the same sort of awareness of where it falls within the Bible. It's a click, and the click doesn't express, okay, this is this far back and in relation to this text in the same way. So it has an effect on the way you read it, which is why most people, at least I think hopefully more and more, will go back to bringing their Bibles with them rather than their phones into church. I believe in the image of the book. We are the people of the book. Christians. Yes, sir.
Pastor, is there something to be said for having the textures of the page between your fingers as you turn?
I think so. I think that's a lesser part of it, but it does reflect. When I remember things, I remember where they are on the page. Like, I can remember, I don't know if everyone else has that same image, but I can sort of see it. Where was that passage? And when you get acquainted with it, it was over, and you can sort of almost feel where it is and find it more quickly. And you remember where it is in a location, a physical location on the page, whereas with an app, it's all the same. And so that it doesn't have, it's harder to remember, actually. It's easier to access because you can just type it in, it goes immediately. You don't have to have the embarrassing flipping around, where is that? Back and forth. But it on the other hand, it makes it more memorable, just simply by virtue of having to physically go through it and find the location in that particular area. So whereas an app is a disembodied experience. I'm just posting a series of lectures I gave a year and a half ago on, or maybe it was 2 years ago, on technology and godliness. I'll give you links if you're interested. I find that aspect of using technology very interesting. We really don't think of ourselves as having bodies. It's me and the screen. And it sort of takes me out of myself, but it has great power. It can connect me to somebody who's in Australia simultaneously. Okay, great. So that's like a superhuman capacity. But what do I lose in the process? And I think you do. Yes?
Sort of go back to the feeling of knowing where the verse is and all that. Does that sort of connect to the belief of the living word of God? How people believe that God is alive in that sort of sense? Does that sort of connect to that?
Well, that's a good question. When it's the living word, in what sense is that true? This is the dead letter, you could say. It's not living, but in what sense is... So one of my prayers I regularly use when preaching is that the words of my mouth might so unpack the written word that it leads us to the living word, who is Jesus. And so what's the relation between my words, my spoken words, the words that I read, and Jesus, who is the Word of God? What's the connection there? Because there is a connection. Anybody who preaches and takes what they do seriously thinks that there is a strong relation there, but what the exact relation is unclear, and I don't think it can be clarified. There's ultimately something mysterious about it. But when Jesus sends out the disciples, 72, and tells them to preach, and they come back to him saying that they have, they've been able to do miraculous things and so forth, what does he say to them? Do you remember? What?
He says to not be pleased about what they did, but rather the relationship that they have with the daughter.
Yeah, well, that's a paraphrase, but yeah, okay. Yes, yes. But at least you remember. Correct. Yes. That's the bigger thing. And so there's a relational aspect of preaching that is the most important thing, not the miraculous signs and wonders but rather the fact that you are now related to the living God. That's the main point there. So, and when he sends them out, they hear God. So you're to preach as one's preaching the very words of God. So it's not your words, but rather God speaking through his spokesman. That's a strong claim, but it's one that Jesus himself endorses. So very interesting. And therefore, this is a different sort of text, because nobody claims that of the works of Shakespeare, at least to my knowledge, other than Harold Bloom, who gave Shakespeare the credit of inventing humanity. Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human, that was the title of his famous book. Talked about modern humanity being the product of Shakespeare's wonderful imagination. A bunch of garbage, of course. And he doesn't mean it literally in one sense. In another sense, he does. He's playing with words there.
Who was this professor?
Harold Bloom, famous American literary critic of the 80s and 90s, and actually the 70s and 60s for that matter. Now strongly reviled because he defended the Western canon, wrote another book called The Western Canon, in fact, and wrote a book called Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human. Says that our contemporary understanding of humanity owes its shape to Shakespeare's dramatic works, our sense of tragic and comic and so forth. Sees a richness there in Shakespeare. I don't disagree that Shakespeare is rich, but I think Shakespeare gets it from somewhere. He doesn't invent it. Fortunately, Bloom did not write on the Bible as literature, although he probably would have had interesting things to say there. But so there's a thinking in images that takes place there. They need to be experienced. They need to be interpreted. It's necessary to do so, and interpretation is hard. And the first difficulty is simply identifying the figures of speech. That's the first challenge. What are they that we are reading, and what's the purpose of them? And that's what this course is to do, is simply to identify those at the very basic level, and then comes the problem of interpretation, but that's not my problem, that's your problem, or it's our problem. I can't solve that problem for you. But the better you are able to identify the features of the poetry, the better you are equipped to do that act of interpretation, which is vital to understanding and not just experiencing. But I will, having said all that, say that the reason it's written in poetry is for you to experience it, not simply for you to translate it into prose and then appreciate it, because actually by the translation you're losing something. Like, God could have written it all in prose if he'd wanted. It could have been given to us in prose. It was not. It was given in poetry. So let's, by all means, interpret, but then hold on to the images and leave them as such. One of my concerns about Eugene Peterson's The Message is it tries to make everything common day speech. I think there's goodness in that, and I think there are problems with that. And I think it's clear from what I've just said what I think the problems are with it. Which is not to take away from it in across the board, but I don't think that poetry can be made into a message. So poets will often use metaphors. Now, what are metaphors? When somebody says that which I happen not to think, but the resurrection is a metaphor, or the incarnation is a metaphor, or the virgin birth is a metaphor, the question always that needs to arise is a metaphor for what? It's something standing for something else. And whenever somebody says that it's a metaphor, you have to ask them the question, well, what's it a metaphor for? They almost, in my experience, they never have an answer for that. They just simply mean it's not to be taken for a historical event. And because I'm an academic, I'm willing to entertain that as a possibility and say, okay, well, if that's the case, then does it have the features of a metaphor? Because the incarnation does not have the features of a metaphor, neither does the resurrection, and neither does the incarnation. I mean, none of them have features of a metaphor. They have features of the miraculous. There's no doubt about that. But that's not a metaphor, unless you are you have a natural presupposition about all language that it can't possibly refer to something supernatural, in which case you're biased and you're not willing to even entertain that it's possible. And I'm not really interested in that conversation if somebody is that hardened in that view. Like if you're not even willing to entertain the fact that you might be wrong or that you may need your vision expanded, then I would say that you're a very narrow-minded, illiberal person. But, so a metaphor, it has two functions. There's denotation and there's connotation. What does it denote? What does it connote? Do you know what I mean by that? Denotation is pretty straightforward because it is almost the literal sense of what the image means. The connotation is the additional symbolic significance that it's attached to when you use the metaphor. So to refer to the leader of your church as a pastor is a metaphor. It is actually a metaphor. So the denotation is the person who fulfills the function of the office. The connotations are all the features of being a shepherd that go with that. Feeding, defending, taking care of, protecting, taking away in inclement weather, and so forth. All of those aspects are the connotations of it. The denotation is simply pastor equals shepherd. So that's clear. But now but the two go together in the metaphor. Metaphor. Let me unpack metaphor. A metaphor is a Greek word. It's a composite, in a sense. What do I do with my? Oh, there I did. Meta on the one hand, and for from Pharaoh. Metaphor is something you carry over. So you carry from here to there. Transfer from here to there. It's both a thinking and a seeing. And the seeing precedes the thinking, by the way. In metaphors, the visual precedes the cognitive. So the literal is the basis for the figurative, not the other way around. You can't get it wrong that way. And that's why, again, I say biblical images can't be replaced with more contemporary images, because you lose something. You can't just say, well, this is what it means, so let me find something that's similar in meaning in contemporary discourse, and then I'll replace it with that. That undermines the literal image there, and something about the literal is important. So you can't hold into that. Now, what the effect of that, by the way, is it forces Christians to be interested in history and to regard it as important and normative in some way. Note that the Bible is written not as one whole event of revelation. It wasn't delivered to someone in a cave. It was delivered over a period of millennia. God gradually revealing himself in history and it's delivered to a people in history in the year now 2019 AD, the year of our Lord. History is the venue in which God operates, and it's also the venue in which not only God operates, but God finds important. So time and space seem to matter to God, even though he himself is outside time and space. He operates within time and space. And so Christians ought to be the people that are most aware of the importance of history in their own personal life. Not only the fact of their parents' experience and their grandparents, but of the church, historic. That the experience of, because remember, those people are part of the church. That they're just simply those that have gone to glory, but they are still the church. They're the church triumphant. We're the church militant. Those are the technical terms, by the way. We're the church under siege. Militant means we're being attacked like soldiers, an army. The church triumphant is now no longer under attack, but they're still with us. The saints in glory sing the song of the bride and the lamb, just like we do. And they're part of the church. They have now passed out of this bodily life, and now they're with us in some sense, simultaneously and at the same time outside of our immediate experience. And yet their historical lives still matter to us. So history matters to Christians. There are lessons that can be learned from it. We live with smartphones, and nobody before us ever lived with one. That is a unique challenge, which we don't know how to handle because it's unique. Does it have precedence in other ways? It does. So the ways that are similar, we can learn from. The ways that are different, we need to be attentive to. So I think, again, the internet technology is a technological means that people have developed with great power and the capacity to reach people in ways that are unprecedented. So again, I can put this up on YouTube, which I will, and somebody in China can watch it. At the same time it appears here, it can be watched there. That's extraordinary. I think there are tools to translate it as well. They're online, and I don't know how good the translations are, but still, that's extraordinary. The power. But it's a unifying. Well, it's like the Tower of Babel. However, it's the unifying power of technology to unite all of humanity. So it is a sort of a Tower of Babel, which is not a good thing, as you know. Because when humanity unites its power, bad things happen. It's the land of Shinar, by the way. Tower of Babel, the land of Shinar, which is mentioned explicitly in Daniel 1. You know what happens in the book of Daniel. This is where the people of God have been brought into exile. Where? Right where the Tower of Babel once stood. That's where they are now. And Nebuchadnezzar is the king and the ruler. So note those little aspects of the text. Powerful. All over the place. Not just, it doesn't say he's in Babylon, it says in the land of Shinar. That's what it says in Daniel. Referred to right there in Genesis 11. Yes. Philip, did you have something to say?
Yes, sir. An organization called the Augustine Institute, it's Roman Catholic. They have produced some absolutely wonderful audio dramas of the lives of the saints, St. Francis of Assisi.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
St. Patrick. They have done 3 so far. They're as good as the Focus on the Family audio dramas.
Yeah.
Just outstanding.
But so these are videos?
Yes, no, audio dramas.
Audio dramas, okay.
Yeah. My question is, why do I have to dig so deep to find stories about the lives of the saints? If after what you said is true and it's important that we understand the history of the church, why haven't I ever heard these stories in all my years of being in the evangelical church?
Well, you have to a lesser extent because you've heard about the evangelical movement. You will have heard about Calvin and Luther and Wesley or whatever. You will have heard about those people or some. Elizabeth Elliot, some missionaries. You'll have heard about them, and they're being presented as more or less saintly individuals. But they're not called such. Right? And then we have our contemporary celebrity pastors who have a sanctified status as well, which is also problematic. We need a whole discussion about the saints there. Church history, yeah.
I'd love to hear you on it sometime.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about it here because it's too far off topic.
Okay.
But I do think there's a place between revering the saints and praying to the saints to pray on your behalf. There's a different position there from the typical Protestant one, which is ignoring Christian history altogether, lest we fall into something like popery or papist belief, right? So we don't want to talk about the lives of the saints because we will then become like Catholics. Well, this is absurd. So we become historically ignorant in order to honor the Lord. This is nonsense, right? I mean, again, if history is the venue for God's Spirit to work, and He works in the church, and He always has worked in the church, then we will want to investigate history and find the way He has worked in different situations and cultures and contexts, and we'll find that those are very beneficial in helping us to decide what are we to do and how are we to live now, without having to pray to them for a particular aid on a particular subject. I say I don't think there's anything wrong with knowing the life of St. Patrick. In fact, it's to be encouraged.
Thank you.
Right? So, the main thrust of the Protestant Reformation against the saints is simply that it suggests that there's a certain category of individual who is a saint, whereas the Bible wants to assert that everyone who is saved by faith is one of the saints. So it's to empower the church to bear witness, everyone, right? Not just a few like superhuman individuals. And the lives of the saints were often embellished and so forth, and that they thought that this was detrimental to the faith as well. But that's a big, broad question. But the importance of Christian history, it's most certainly the case.
I love your choice of verb, Professor, investigate, because in my experience, the people that I have interacted with other than these wonderful students here at Tyndale don't investigate beyond their own event horizons.
Well, that's a characteristic of our age.
It drives me crazy.
Yeah, it drives me crazy too. But, I scream against the darkness a lot, but I try not to, that's not my life's work. There's benefit to identifying sin and error and so forth. It's important because I've found that some people simply can't see it, probably because they don't want to see it, but then it's my burden and responsibility to point it out. On the other hand, there's no good or little good that's done in saying there's a pit hole, don't step in that. Rather, how am I going to bring something to flourish? Well, then you have to present positive things, good things. That's why I chose to work in a Christian university in the end, leaving the public institutions. And it was not an easy decision, I can tell you, and not one I always think, I sometimes wonder, did I do the right thing? But I prayed about it at the time and made my decision, and then now I'm just seeing where God's leading on all of that. That's the way things are in life.
My 2 cents worth means anything, Professor. I think you made the right call.
Yeah. I don't know. Who knows what the path would have been had I gone differently. I think it's right as well, but I don't know any different. Yeah. No, I have a strong sense of that, so it's good. So there's a use of metaphor. No, so then the question is why? Why are metaphors and similes used? If we want to see metaphors as the chief means of thinking in images, then why? Well, one is because they're vivid and complete. In a short fashion, they're memorable. So when you think of Jesus as the Lamb, it's vivid. There's a completeness to it. On the other hand, it's not totally complete because he's also the lion. John hears a voice in heaven, and he looks, and behold, he sees one who looked like a lamb who'd been slain. It was the Lion of the tribe of Judah. By the way, you're not supposed to mix your metaphors. It's terrible. It's a terrible feature of bad writing, is to mix your metaphors. The Bible does it all the time. At least in the book of Revelation, it's constantly mixing its metaphors. Why? Because there's no other way of describing it. There's a reality so rich that it needs the mixture of metaphors that are actually in many ways contradictory. Now, a Christian will understand that, maybe because of Aslan or something, but there's one passage in the Narnia Chronicles where they see a little lamb, and it's not just and that's also Aslan, right? But he's usually the lion, and the lion keeps on getting bigger as well as they get bigger. The lion gets bigger. That's also interesting what Lewis is doing there. But there's a vividness and a concreteness about the images which is important for people who use their eyes and who experience things concretely as we do in our bodies. So those visual images are in some ways an accommodation to the fact that we are embodied beings. So it's presenting spiritual truths in concrete form. Just like God's truth is presented us in forms of beauty, because beauty draws us to the good and the true, because we have sensations. Secondly, it's actually the very reason they're frustrating is why they're also used. They resist easy assimilation. It's not easy to digest a metaphor. In fact, you can't. Like most things you eat, you swallow, you assimilate, and then you get rid of what you don't need. A metaphor doesn't allow you to do that. There's something that does resist assimilation, so you just have to hold on to it. And then finally, there's a precision to it. That's the surprising thing. So the second thing is that it's resistant to easy assimilation. On the other hand, it's very precise. And that's why I say you can't replace the idea of the lion. Note that even Lewis is not going to replace the lion with a tiger. Blake does that, actually, but in his poem, The Tiger. Got the lion, or the lamb and the tiger. Why he does that, I don't know. But in general, there's a precision to that. It's part of the experience of people in Israel that they would have had lions, a fearsome beast. But there's a vividness and a concreteness on the one hand, which is why we use metaphors and similes. Secondly, they're resistant to easy assimilation. And thirdly, they are precise. And the reason that surprises us is that we think that scientific language is the most precise. Because we've bought in to the mythology of science. I'm giving a lecture, by the way, in Calgary in less than 2 weeks on the mythology of science, an apologetics conference. I haven't written it yet, so I'm terrified. I think you pray for me. The mythology of science. I'll have all these atheist scientists out there sharpening their swords. Actually, I'm not really terrified. I love it.
Is this going to be recorded?
Oh, yeah. So that's fun. That's fun stuff. But I think there's a precision to language. By the way, Darwinists can't account for language yet, by the way. They have no accounting for language. Absolutely none. Which Darwin himself recognized was a great problem for Darwinism, as he couldn't account for language. It drove him mad. 150 years on, they still have no accounting for it. If you have no accounting for the basic feature of human nature that distinguishes a human being from the animals, you have no accounting for it, then your theory is not very good. It's not. Let alone to call it science and everything else is not. This is just abusive and ridiculous. So I'm going to turn it around and go after them because that's fun. But from Aristotle onwards, it's common in the Western tradition, and I only say the Western because I'm not well acquainted with Eastern traditions or others, but it's common for experts to agree that the ability to think in metaphor is a poetic ability. So to think in metaphors and to write in metaphors, this is what distinguishes poets. So vitally metaphoric. As I say, Coleridge says that poetry distinguishes itself from prose by virtue of being metrical language. And I agree with Coleridge. He's correct. At least he's correct in English, and he's correct in most European languages, or all European language, but in Hebrew not so. And the ability to think in metaphor does distinguish the poet, but prose writers can also use metaphors. So that's why it's not the distinctive mark. But poetry particularly uses metaphors. For example, this famous Psalm 23. is clearly a metaphor again. The Lord is my shepherd. He's not like my shepherd. He is my shepherd. In what sense does a person have a shepherd? In the sense that a person is a sheep. In what sense is a person a sheep? Do you know how stupid sheep are? And weak and helpless and finicky and susceptible to disease? It's not flattery, by the way. When you think of yourself and you get the pictures of Jesus with a lamb in his arms, and oh, cute and cozy. Yeah, Jesus holding the stupidest animal he can imagine in his arms. That's you. Oh, that's great. It's the stupidest, most vulnerable, helpless. That's you. Yes. Nice. Yes. And he looks like a Dutchman with a long beard and blue eyes, too. Yeah. That's you and that's him. Yeah. Yep. Where Jesus is the Word of God, he's not the picture of God. So there's problems with pictorial representations. Anyway. So metaphors and similes are images and pictures. Note that the Bible constantly uses, I keep hearing that people are visual learners. And I'm not a good visual teacher, I'm a lecturer. And I say, yes, and so was Jesus. And he didn't have a problem with that. He didn't have PowerPoints.